Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 198, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On today's episode, I'm going to be discussing Mike Pompeo's demands that he made of Iran, 12 in total, and I'm going to go through each one and explain why it's either, an actual demand that could be met by Iran, completely fictional, or would cost Iran its complete sovereignty. So, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org if you want to share the show. And just a quick note on the show, the 200th episode will be next week. I have 3 interviews set to air for next week's episode. I'll go ahead and let you know, episode 199, I just recorded the interview with Anthony Samaroff of the Scottish Liberty podcast. I think we had a wonderful conversation. You'll really enjoy it. Talking a lot about libertarianism, foreign policy, and morality when it comes to war. All right, to get into today's stuff, the first thing I want to touch on is North Korea. So on the 23rd, there was actually some pretty positive news coming out, and that is Donald Trump had met with Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, and said that while he prefers North Korea agree to rapid Libyan, he didn't say Libyan style, but this rapid denuclearization that John Bolton proposed, that if you want to listen to Foreign Policy Focus 197, I go on about how it's this very dangerous idea that North Korea would rapidly give up all their weapons of mass destruction as Libya did in 2003. And, Trump acknowledges that, there's some logistical problems here. And I was like, hey, maybe this guy's listening to Foreign Policy Focus. Cause this is what I'm talking about, that, the size and the scope of the North Korean program is massively larger than the Libyan program. And so it really doesn't make sense to think that North Korea could possibly logistically denuclearize as quickly as Libya did. However, then the next day we get the terrible news is that it says the United States sent a letter to Kim Jong-un saying that they would not be attending the summit on June 12th in Singapore. I'm going to save the analysis for this on Monday's show just because I haven't got really a good chance to dig through the literature on it yet and see what people are saying and what the important details are. It's going to be important to know who in Trump's administration pushed for this, if it was Donald Trump or John Bolton, and how the South Koreans and the North Koreans react to this news, and what all the important factors are. So, all right, now let's move on to Mike Pompeo's speech. I think this is the first big speech Mike Pompeo gave as Secretary of State and not as CIA director. In this speech, he talked about quite a few things, and some of them I've linked to on Immersion News. I think the claim by Pompeo was that the Iranians have been carrying out assassination operations within Europe. Now, it seems to me like some Pentagon or State Department propagandists just mixed up their Iranian and their Russian propaganda here, because typically it's accused of Russia of carrying out assassinations in Europe and not Iran. So anyway, the tone of the speech is very hawkish, and factual claims and actually presenting evidence are nowhere within this speech. But at one point, Mike Pompeo clearly lays out 12 demands for Iran, and I think it's important that we go over them because these are the neocon warhawk talking points on Iran. And it's important to understand them because these are the things that people will say, well, we have to go to Iran because of the missile program. We'll have to go to Iran because they won't allow IAEA inspections everywhere. So I'm just going to go through this. Demand number 1. Iran must declare to the IAEA a full account of the prior military dimensions of its nuclear program and permanently and verifiably abandon such work in perpetuity. Now, I guess the question is what would the U.S. demand here be? At one point, Trump mentioned in his speech about actually withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear agreement. He said that the Iranians have shown that they are no longer allowed to have a civilian nuclear program. And so is the United States, what is the actual demand? Is it just that Iran says, hey, we never want to make a nuclear bomb? Because Iran has said that now. In fact, their supreme leader has issued a religious edict against making a nuclear weapon. But I think more likely, and maybe what Trump said in his speech, is that Iran completely gives up any nuclear energy program, civilian in nature even, as a way of proving that they never want to get nuclear weapons. And obviously, no country will agree to that, to abandon one of the main forms of energy use for people on this planet. That's ridiculous, and it's not going to happen. Now, let's just say that it is Mike Pompeo saying, yeah, the Iranians agree that they're not going to make a nuclear weapon, and they must give the IAEA the full account of their previous nuclear program. Well, that's already been done. So, this really isn't a worthy demand if that's the case. Number 2, Iran must stop uranium enrichment and never pursue plutonium reprocessing. This includes closing the heavy water reactor. So one of the problems here is that part of Iran's nuclear enrichment, and in fact what they agreed to under the IAEA, is only to enrich to 3.6% or so, and that's the level that allows them to enrich uranium to the point where they could use it to make nuclear fuel. Now, prior to entering into the JCPOA agreement, Iran was part of just the NPT, and through that they were able to enrich uranium up to 20%, and they use this to then make medicine, some of the cancer medicines. However, under the JCPOA, they agreed that they would only enrich up to 3.6%. But that 3.6% is necessary to use as nuclear fuel and is an important part of, having a viable nuclear energy program. So completely stopping the enrichment of uranium seems like a non-starter. Now, maybe there's some room for negotiation here. Maybe if the United States agrees that Russia could enrich the uranium for Iran, and Iran agrees that this is okay with them, maybe there is some room for negotiation there. However, it's not that big of a deal. Also, as far as it goes into creating a nuclear weapon, Iran already has the knowledge to enrich uranium, and I think once you have shown that you can enrich uranium, it's only a matter of time and quantity of nuclear material that it would take to enrich uranium to the point where you can make a nuclear weapon. So the difference between Iran not enriching uranium at all and only enriching to 3.6% isn't a big deal dealing with Iran's nuclear capabilities. Really what it does is it handicaps the country and makes the country unable to provide its own nuclear fuel, and which is important because remember, a country like Iran has experienced some of the strictest sanctions from the United States, and the Trump administration is promising to put the strictest sanctions or the strongest sanctions in history. During the Obama administration, he actually got the rest of the countries of the world to go along with a lot of these restrictions, and for that reason, things like Iranian planes fall out of the sky far more often than they should, just because they can't get the parts they need to repair their planes or to buy new planes. In fact, that was one of the real selling points of the nuclear agreement for the Iranians, is then they would then be able to buy Boeing and Airbus planes to update their fleet. And for this reason, the Iranians are probably more aware of how important it is that they don't have to rely on outside sources for their necessary needs. Like energy is a very important one. And so it's important to keep that in mind when you realize why Iran may think it's really important that they continue to enrich uranium to 3.6% or so. I'm also sure that the United States would probably require that Iran get rid of its nuclear centrifuges in exchange, for showing that they're no longer going to enrich uranium. And I'm pretty sure there's no, proof that Iran ever really planned to enrich plutonium. And so, that's just thrown in there as a boogeyman kind of thing. Demand number 3, Iran must also provide the IAEA with unqualified access to all sites throughout the entire country. I mean, this is just a non-starter. It's a poison pill. No country would ever agree to this. It's essentially giving up the country's sovereignty to say that the IAEA, UN watchdog group, could go anywhere, anytime. Now, if you already know that in the past, John Bolton has been very willing to threaten and even, in a way blackmail some of these heads of international agencies. And so, if the Iranians are just have any kind of, covert program, not dealing with nuclear weapons, but, just defense or whatever, or any country having their secrets, because every country has those, they would be completely giving this up. Obviously, this isn't going to happen. Basically, what the Americans want to be able to do is go look under the Ayatollah's bed anytime they want. And the idea that the United States would somehow allow the IAEA to have unqualified access to the White House is absolutely laughable. And it's also important to remember that under the agreement, the JCPOA that Trump recently withdrew from, there was a process where if any country presented evidence to the signatory states of the JCPOA that Iran was making nuclear weapons, and the countries assess that the evidence was valid or credible enough to warrant, inspection, then the IAEA could go and inspect, I guess, any site within Iran. And so we almost had this before. Now, some people say, well, you need to convince the signatories to the JCPOA. Well, it just so happens that the United States, France, Germany, and the UK are a majority of the signatories there. So it's not like, we're not only convincing our allies is all we have to do. Number 4, Iran must end its proliferation of ballistic missiles and halt further launching or develop of nuclear-capable missile system. Now, maybe this one sounds reasonable, and I certainly think it's not within the realm of possibility for the United States to negotiate some kind of idea, deal with Iran to limit, their missile exports or their, missile program at home. It's important to note that Iran has currently capped their ballistic missile program at 2,000 kilometers, and their other program is not a ballistic missile program, but it's a commercial space program. Now, my guess here is that if the United States actually want to impose a blanket one-sided deal, it would look an awful lot like Iran no longer being able to launch commercial satellites into space. And as I explained before, you could say, well, a lot of countries don't have a space program. We could just say, well, Iran, you don't have a space program anymore, but the Russians or the Chinese agreed to let you use theirs. Well, Iran could say, yeah, well, we've had these kind of agreements in the past, and then, this could then be used against us if we're relying on other countries for it. No thanks. Now, if you say the United States government is going to take the more reasonable position, which they frequently don't, but that Iran doesn't have to give up its space program, just its nuclear-capable missile program, it's important to note 2 things. One, the ballistic missiles that the Iranians are designing are not nuclear-capable. The missiles just aren't big enough to carry that large of a payload. And space program rockets are distinct from missile program, ballistic missile program kind of rockets. So, Iran should be able to continue to test and develop its ballistic missiles so long as they're not large enough to carry a nuclear weapon, and continue to launch the space satellites. However, I'm guessing that there's some dual technology problems there, and anytime the Iranians are doing any kind of missile tests, it'll be a chance for the United States to claim they're violating the agreement. And for that reason, I think it would be very difficult to get an agreement like this done, just because I think the American position would be so irrational. But, maybe there are negotiations that could be made here where Iran would somehow agree to give up one certain kind of piece of technology that would be distinct to missiles that would carry, nuclear payloads. And not to mention here, the problem is that under the JCPOA, Iran was very far away from being able to develop a nuclear weapon. They had never tested one. They don't really know how to miniaturize one. And they had nowhere near the amount of nuclear fuel they would need in the country. Oh yeah, they poured concrete into the heavy water reactor, which I should have mentioned under demand number 2 is that, Mike Pompeo says this includes closing the heavy water reactor. Well, he's years late. The Iranians already poured concrete into it. And so making a demand of something that never happened is, again, silly. So it'll be very difficult for Iran to even get the material needed to make a nuclear weapon, then to get the technology needed to make a nuclear weapon, and they don't have the rockets to do it. And so this demand really doesn't make sense. Number 5, Iran must release all U.S. citizens as well as citizens of our partners and allies, each of those detained on spurious charges. Now, anybody who's being held in Iran for something that isn't a crime should be released, right? I think we can all agree to that. And I'm sure that this is something that the Iranians would probably be willing to negotiate on. If you remember, during the time that the Iran deal was, being negotiated with the Obama administration, you'll remember that there were some U.S., I think, Marines in a training exercise in the Persian Gulf, and they drifted into Iranian territory with a disabled boat. And the Iranians picked them up and within a couple days returned them to the Americans. So obviously Iran would be willing to negotiate on these kind of situations. Now, I think some of the problems here are, in the totality of the demand, saying that they must release all prisoners of U.S. and U.S. allies. Now, U.S. allies would include the Afghan government, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptians. Now, you're telling me there's not a single, guy of any of those, places that went to Iran and ended up committing something that's an actual crime there. So if the United States is really going to demand everybody, then Iran may say, well, these people commit legitimate crimes. And then I'm guessing there's also going to be some problems surrounding like maybe some guys associated with the MEK. I believe that's a Mujahideen Khalq. That's an Iranian-based Marxist terror group that has connections with the U.S. and our Arab allies. So, I'm sure there would be a lot of like kind of people where the Iranians would say, well, we're not releasing this guy because this guy is a national criminal in our eyes. And in fact, if the United States had that guy in their custody, would probably feel that they were an actual criminal as well. So again, I think as long as Mike Pompeo drops the all to this one, I think it's something that could actually be met, and the United States could make some real progress in getting the U.S. citizens and maybe some other people who were wrongly detained in Iran. Iran must end support of Middle East terror groups, including Lebanon Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I would think to some extent there's probably some negotiations that could happen here. If the United States is demanding all of it happen, the Iranians are never going to do that. And if you look at it, it wouldn't really resolve the problems that the United States thinks it would resolve either. And I think this would be a real problem for the Iranians, is that even if they stop supporting Hezbollah would still be a problem for Israel and would prevent Israel from being able to invade southern Lebanon. Even if Iran stopped funding Hamas, the Palestinians would continue to protest. They would continue to demand the right of return, and this wouldn't solve Israeli problems. And so I think from the perspective of Iran, there's probably nothing to be gained by actually stopping the funding of these groups, because any success that these groups have will always be blamed on Iran anyways. And the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I don't think is a very powerful group or anything that Iran supports that actually really inflicts any damage. I think Hamas is the prevailing group there in Gaza. Number 7, Iran must respect the sovereignty of the Iraqi government and permit the disarming, demobilization, and reintegration of Shia militias. Now, to an extent, I think this is going to be somewhat out of the hands of Iran. Iraq is a state that elected a somewhat nationalist-leaning leader, and in fact, I'm hoping next week to get into a little bit more about Mohammed al-Sadr. But, there's enough Iraqi nationalism that really makes it so that the Iranians don't just have free reign over the Iraqi government. As far as the Shia militias go, I'm not super up to date on what the status of their demobilization and reintegration is. I know that to some extent this has happened already, probably not to the extent of the U.S. liking, and any groups holding out and remaining independent militias of the Iraqi government are probably the ones that are most anti-U.S. government. So that's probably the one the U.S. has the most problems with. However, maybe there's some, negotiation able to be happened here. And it's also worth remembering the U.S. has 8,000 troops in Iraq of our own. And so if we're talking about Iraqi sovereignty and we're condemning Iran for having influence in Iraq, well, the biggest influencer in Iraq over the past, 25 years or so would be the American. Number 8, Iran must end support for Houthis and work towards peace in Yemen. Okay, so this is just pretty much a complete non-starter. Iran really doesn't support the Houthis in Yemen. I think the Iranians find the Houthis to be kind of a convenient group for them, creating a situation where Saudi Arabia and the UAE have bogged themselves down in Yemen. And so it's kind of worked out well that all their enemies ended up picking on this group that's been a real problem for them. But at the same time, Iran doesn't support the Houthis. In fact, they told the Houthis not to take the capital city of Yemen, and then told them not to move south and take more territory of that country. And Obama even acknowledged this, this was back in 2014, 2015. And yet the Houthis did it anyways. And so they really don't listen to, Iran and all their advice. And when you say that Iran must negotiate a peace in Yemen, you see that Iran has very little influence in that conflict. The main groups, the country that could stop the war in Yemen, it's Donald Trump. It's the United States. If we stop providing Saudi Arabia with bombs, if we stop providing them with mid-air refueling, if we stop supporting them, ending the blockade, and enforce international law and allow aid ships and cargo ships full of civilian goods like food and medicine for babies and fuel so people could have somewhat normal lives in Yemen, then, the war would end pretty much instantly. And, there may still be some regional fighting, but, the worst of the war, the blockade and the air war would subside in Yemen, pretty quickly. Of course, the claim is always that Iran is giving the Houthis ballistic missiles to launch at Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and I think makes reference to this in a later statement. However, the Yemenis are using converted Scud missiles and then just rockets that they make within their own country that aren't very advanced to launch at Saudi Arabia and the UAE. As far as it goes, complain about the ballistic missiles, I guess, when they hit civilian targets and stuff. I don't like that. And, indiscriminate bombing isn't a great thing. But this is, the only way the Houthis have to strike back against the people who are bombing them every day. And bombing civilian targets like hospitals, like schools, like weddings, like funerals, and killing massive number of civilians. Okay, so obviously, as far as this demand goes from Mike Pompeo, 1, Iran doesn't have enough influence in Yemen to end the war. And 2, Iran doesn't support the Houthis. This brings us to demand number 9. Iran must withdraw all forces under Iranian command throughout the entirety of Syria. I'm not sure to what extent that this would be part of a negotiated settlement in Syria without the U.S. demand. I'm sure you would see a drawdown of Iranian forces in Syria as, Assad looks to assert more sovereignty over his own country and recaptures territory and defeats the various terror groups that remain in the country. But that's not going to happen. And also, if you're looking at a sovereignty issue, well, the Assad government, which, like Amarna, is a ruler of Syria, and he invited the Iranian forces to be there. The Americans are there uninvited and in violation of Syrian sovereignty. And, one of the reasons for Assad's popularity is that the United States backed terror groups and, hopes to overthrow Assad. And this created a situation where, maybe the Arab Spring in Syria would have been able to produce actual reforms. What it did is it produced a rebellion to Assad that was more extreme than he was. Maybe, like I said, as far as the demand goes, maybe this is something that Iran could actually do. Part of the problem is that Mike Pompeo here is asking Iran to, withdraw all of their support from Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And this completely gives up all their regional ambitions, something that no country would give up, even if I don't really support Iran, engaging in all these regional ambitions. It seems, a non-starter to demand that Iran meet all of them. Number 10. Iran must end support for the Taliban and other terrorists in Afghanistan and the region and cease harboring al-Qaeda terrorist leaders. Okay, so parts of this are untrue. The Iran, I don't think they provide, really, there's no proof that they provide any assistance to the Taliban. But if they do, it may just be because the Taliban make a good foil for the Americans. And keeping them bogged down in Afghanistan is probably a good thing as far as the Iranian perspective goes. And remember, this was the policy of the Americans to undermine the Soviets in the 1980s in Afghanistan. So it wouldn't be so ridiculous to assume that, that Iran could be doing this. But if anything, this should be a warning sign to the Americans that we're getting involved in another Vietnam in Afghanistan. Or we're already involved in one, but this should be a clear sign that that's happening. As far as Iran goes supporting terrorists in the regions, really the group support that Iran supports in the region are Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hamas to a much lesser extent than claimed. I think a lot of the money they claim goes to Hamas is Iran pays something of grievance payments to the families of people who die, Palestinians who die in Greater Israel. And so some of this money does go to families of fighters of Hamas. However, we may disagree with that. You may say, well, that seems like funding terrorists. The situation is, however, is that if a member of a family ends up, joining Hamas and then dying or, fighting against Israel, the members of the family will lose their home. They'll lose their right to work anywhere. They'll no longer be able to get job permits. It'll be very hard for them to travel. And so, without that money, innocent people who did nothing would die. And then the al-Qaeda terrorists, this is something that the Iranians, I believe, agreed to negotiate on right after 9/11. They said, hey, that we have some al-Qaeda guys in here living under house arrest, or, they're traveling through areas of our country that we don't have a ton of influence over, but we know where they are. So if you want them, we could get them and bring them to you. And the Americans said, we're not going to negotiate like that. And so if this is something that the Americans want, it's something that's achievable. I'm not sure to what extent that Al-Qaeda leaders still remain in Iran, though, right now, unless, of course, they're talking about the Mujahideen Khalq, which is a group that Rudy Giuliani recently spoke in front of in the United States. Iran must end the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, support for militias around the world. I mean, what, you're going to demand that a country shut down a portion of their military, and for the Iranians, I would assume probably the most elite portion of their military, not going to happen. One of the unfortunate things about the United States withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear agreement is that the Iranian people elected Rouhani, who was more of a moderate than the rest of the candidates possible in Iran. And it was Rouhani who extended the hand to the Americans and ended up agreeing to a nuclear agreement which really limited Iran's nuclear program, destroyed the heavy water reactor, and guaranteed that Iran could not have a secret nuclear weapons program to develop a nuclear bomb. And now, by the United States withdrawing from it with no proof that Iran is violating it, and with Iran completely showing their hands and saying that, hey guys, we're not violating it, but the U.S. withdrawing anyway, has made them look like a fool. And so now you're empowering the hardliners in Iran. Now these people are looking like, hey, we're the ones that said I told you so to the Iranian nuclear deal. We told you not to do it because you gave up our heavy water reactor. And now the Americans left the deal anyways. We told you they couldn't be trusted and they can't be. And so, imagine how elections go in the United States and think about how that's going to play in Iran. Because Iran does have elections. That's a very important part to this, is that, we are supposed to be supporters of democracy, yet we're taking the side of the absolute monarchies in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia against the side of, while there's the Ayatollah in Iran, a somewhat moderate, democratically elected leader in Iran. And so anyways, a hardliner would be more attached to and more supportive of the IRGC than Rouhani was. And so if you want to disempower that group, the way to go would have been to stick within the Iranian nuclear agreement, added a missile agreement to get further sanctions released, maybe do some hostage trading or whatever to encourage some more good faith, and, keep moving in a positive direction. And then the economy of Iran gets better. The people of Iran live in a more free and open world, and, they continue to elect more moderate leaders. All right, the final demand of Mike Pompeo, like we already haven't gotten enough. Iran must end threatening behavior against neighbors, threats to Israel, firing missiles in Saudi and UAE, and disrupting shipping and cyber attacks. I mean, there's a lot here. I guess the first point is that as far as Iranian threatening behavior goes, it's not like Iran is necessarily carrying out missile attacks all the time like North Korea was or something like that. And so threatening behavior from Iran, I think, just really means like, the political leaders of the country saying death to America or death to Israel. I think it's important to remember that the United States and, different politicians, especially during the Republican primaries, were advocating for, nuclear weapons to be used on several different cities across the world. And so it's not unlike politicians to make big threats and to spur people together with hatred because, look at Donald Trump, right? I already addressed the firing of missiles in Saudi Arabia and the UAE under the Yemen section. As far as the, shipping in Iran's behavior in the Persian Gulf, even the Americans admitted that was better from about August of 2017 till the United States decided to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear agreement. I haven't heard if Iran's speedboats are messing around with the U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf lately. But, this was a problem before, and the United States, hey, the Iranians weren't doing this. And so it seemed that staying within the JCPOA was enough to deter that problem. And I'm not aware of any critical cyber attacks coming from Iran against its neighbors. However, cyber warfare is something that happens now, and it seems to be one of the dangerous things, and it's really hard to attribute to, who's the guilty party. But I'm guessing that if Iran entered into some kind of cyber agreement with the United States, then suddenly there'd be a lot of U.S. warhogs finding Iranian cyber attacks against the United States. All right, I just want to give a brief overall view of this. One, if you take these things one at a time, maybe there's 4 of them that you could actually meet or achieve or made some progress towards. I think I counted 5 or 6 of them were just not either non-negotiable or non-factual enough to actually be discussed. And I think the big problem here is you already saw what the Americans did to the JCPOA, and it would take a lot of trust, I think, to get Iran to agree to any of these other things. And the United States position is Iran must give up everything. And, I'll link to the article in the show notes page that lays out the 12 points. I got it from The Drive, which is a pretty pro-military fight. And even in there, they say none of these things are unreasonable one by one. But if you look at all of them, Iran's given up their complete sovereignty. And I think that's the truth, is that the United States is asking Iran to give up everything. And of course, they're not going to do that. Of course, that's not going to happen. And, it's worrisome that this, will be the excuse used for war. In 6 months from now, when John Bolton's saying, look, Iran still hasn't complied with 9 of these. Iran still hasn't complied with 8 of these. In fact, they're going against 6 of them right now. They're staying in Syria. They're staying in Yemen. They're staying in Iraq, blah, 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 blah. All right. That's where I'll wrap up the show for today. I hope you all enjoyed the shows next week. I got, like I said, it's a big guest coming on the show. Really excited for the 200th episode. So think about sharing those shows, and this one, of course, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, at KYAAALE on Twitter, Libertarian Union on Facebook, Immersion News on YouTube and BitChute. And of course, Immersion News is the, new, really cool news site I run. You all should check it out. Thanks, everyone.